Well, I think we'll get started this evening. Welcome to the Mystic and Noack Library. We're finishing up almost a whole year of talks celebrating Groton's 300th birthday. So we're at the end of the season here, and we're so pleased to have Leslie Evans here this evening to talk with us about the Avery-Copp House. And I'm looking forward to learning more about it, as I'm sure many of you are. So we'll get started. Here you are, Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to welcome you all and thank you for coming. I am Leslie Evans. I'm curator of the Avery-Copp House Museum, and we are a Victorian house museum on the banks of the Thames River in Groton, Connecticut. And what I brought to show you tonight was a collection of photographs of the house, and I've divided them up into three parts. And what I think I'd like to do is show you a little bit about the history of the house, about how it began and evolved over time as it changed with the generations of the families that lived there. How it started as a much simpler house and was embellished and Victorianized to bring it to the point that we see it today. And then that'll be in part one, and then part two will be just like a walk through the house as if you were visiting it. We'll just go from room to room and see what they all look like inside. And I do have some old pictures of the way the house looked in the 19th century, and then pictures of the way it looks today. And then in the third part of my talk, I'll just discuss some of the challenges that we face taking this old house and many generations of family possessions and papers and all the things that have accumulated there and turning it into a museum, taking it from being a private home into a museum, and some of the issues that we face with that, maintenance issues that come familiar to anybody who's tried to care for an old house, and then some that are particular to the realm of a museum, like how to make the house accessible to people and how to preserve the things that are inside it and also make them usable for historians in years to come. So we'll go through these slides talking about those things, and then at the end, if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask about the house, I'm happy to answer any that I can. I did bring some old photographs that I put along the back wall as well, and a scrapbook that has wallpaper samples in it that you might be interested to look at that we found in the house, and also a flyer back there telling about an open house that we'll be having at the end of this month. It's a holiday open house, but it's after Christmas, so it won't be so hectic at that time. But you can come and see the house decorated for the holidays, and it's in the evening, so that's a time when you don't often get to see a museum, and just come and walk through at your own pace. It's open from 5 to 7 o'clock on December 30th, so maybe some of you will be able to come for that and bring your friends. So I'll go ahead and start by showing you this picture of the house as it looks today. And if you were standing on Thames Street and looking at it, this is what you would see. It's set on a hillside, so behind the house it's a pretty steep hill. And across the street, if you were standing on that veranda and facing out, you would see the river. We're just across the street from the Thames River. It's a very vital harbor still, a lot of boat traffic in and out all the time, commercial boats as well as pleasure boats, and ranging in size from kayaks to huge tankers that come in there from all around the world. So it's very much a working harbor still. If you were to go around the back of the house, you would see this. We're on a hillside, as I said, and it's terraced grass, lawn, with lots of trees and a number of outbuildings dating from the 19th century. In addition to the summer houses, or the gazebo that you see here, there's an old outhouse still on the property. There's a barn that was turned into a carriage house that's still there. There's a spring house that covers over a natural spring that comes out of the hillside and served for many years as a public water supply source. And there are two of these beautiful summer houses. There's this one that's down low near the house, and then as you walk up the hillside, you come to another one. Whoops, I keep going backwards with these slides, I'm sorry. This other one that's further up the hill. And I imagine how pleasurable it must have been to sit in those and just enjoy the cool breeze off the river under those trees at a time before electricity, when there was no air conditioning, no fans that you could have used to cool off in the hot summer. But to go and sit up there and just try and get some relief from the heat, and also have a wonderful view of the street down below, see what everybody was doing going up and down, and then out to the river and to Long Island Sound beyond. So it's really a lovely landscape there of about 3 acres. Some very old trees there. We have some really old copper beeches and some old spruce trees and old maples and a number of other unusual trees. At one time there were many more trees. Some have been lost to storms over the years, particularly the hurricane of 1938 took down a lot of them. But it's still a lovely place to walk up there. This is in a neighborhood called the Groton Bank, meaning river bank, or sometimes called Groton Heights, because it is a very steep hill and there's a lot of rocky outcroppings there. The top of the hill and just down the street is Fort Griswold Battlefield State Park, and this is the site of the Revolutionary War Battle of Groton Heights that was fought there. This is looking up to the remains of the fort from down at the base of it. And this was a really important event in the history of this neighborhood. When this happened in 1781, a lot of men and boys who lived in the neighborhood fought there defending this fort against Benedict Arnold and his English troops that were determined to take it. A lot of them were killed there. Many Avery family members died in this battle. Many neighborhood fathers and sons and brothers died there. And the neighborhood also suffered because it was burned. A lot of the important houses and businesses were burned at that time. And so there were many women left widows with families to raise and no houses to live in. This is a view from inside the fort looking at the Groton Monument and commemorating people who died in that battle. And I'm talking about this battle because it was important in the history of the land where the Avery-Copp House is now. Before the Avery-Copp House was there was another house, an older, smaller, simpler colonial house. And after this battle, when Colonel Ledyard, who led the defense of the fort, was killed, he left a widow with a young family to raise, and her house was burned. So her brother-in-law, who owned the property where the Avery-Copp House is now, let her live there in this littler house. And so her name was Anna Ledyard, and she lived there and raised her family, lived there until she died in 1790. And her descendants then sold the house to Rufus Avery, who also had fought at Fort Griswold but survived it. And Rufus Avery was already living on Thames Street, and this was his house. This house is right next door to the Avery-Copp House, and we've come into the habit of calling it the Yellow House, but it's really called the Rufus Avery House. And it was built in the 1780s, and Rufus Avery raised his family there. And then when he purchased the land that the Avery-Copp House is on, he changed the house there dramatically. More than changed it, he really rebuilt it and made a bigger house that his 2 sons could live in when they married. And what he created there was a twin of this yellow house. And that was the beginning of the Avery-Copp House. It started life looking like this. This yellow house has had a few Victorian embellishments put on there. There's a bay window in the front and a little projection off to the side. But it, in essence, looks very much like it would have looked in its beginning. And the Avery-Copp House looked like that too. And this is the 2 houses viewed from across the street, side by side. And if you look at the Avery-Copp House on the right and just in your imagination strip away that central tower that's there, and the verandas in the front and the dormers on top and the bay windows and all, if you could just take off all that, you would see the bones of the house are really the same as the yellow house next door. And so that's how the house remained for many years. Rufus Avery eventually sold the house to his cousin, who was named Latham Avery. And this is Latham. Latham Avery went to sea, and he went to South America, and he did a number of adventurous things and made his fortune and came home to Groton and then married. And he married a lady who was more than 20 years younger than him. He was in his 40s by the time he came back and married. And he first rented the Avery-Copp house and then purchased it from his cousin Rufus. This is Latham's wife. Her name is Betsy Wood Lester Avery. So you'll recognize lots of old names from the area as we talk about these people that lived in the house. And they had a large family. They had 7 children who grew up in this house. Betsy, although she was much younger than Latham, she did die before him, leaving him with all these young children to raise. And they grew up there in the house, and 2 of them stayed on there for the rest of their lives. They were 2 girls. After Latham, the father, died, the house came into the possession of Mary Jane Avery, his daughter. And this is Mary Jane. She lived there with her sister, Deb Avery. Now, Mary Jane eventually married a Mr. Ramsdell, who was a successful banker from New London. And because he was prosperous and he seemed to be very indulgent with Mary Jane, his money really allowed her to change the house and change it from the early Federal period house that it had been in her youth to the Victorian house that she wanted it to be. And she did a lot of things to the house. She put in new floors, new floorboards. She put in wallpaper everywhere, even on the ceilings, bay windows and verandas and dormers, and enlarged the kitchen L, and just made it a much more elaborate and, in her eyes, a much more beautiful house. She was trying to keep up with the Victorian aesthetic. And this is a picture of how the house looked in Mary Jane's time once she was through doing all these changes. She also did a lot of work to the landscape. She built those summer houses that we saw earlier, planted a lot of trees here, some exotic varieties of trees. Some of these, if you were able to look at this photograph closely for a long time, you'll see a lot of those plants are really in pots and would have been taken in the winter and then brought back out in the warmer time of year. So this is the house in about 1870. She also changed what had been a barn to a carriage house. And this is the carriage house just a little bit south of the main house, and it's all covered with ivy in this picture. It's still standing. And she did have a carriage there and a horse, and just brought the house into a whole different era here. She really beautified things and altered them considerably. Now, Mary Jane didn't have any children, and she died before her sister Deb, and so Deb inherited the house. And then when Deb passed away, she didn't have children either. The house was left to their niece, and the niece's name was Bessie Avery, and Bessie Avery had married Belton Copp. He was Belton Copp II in a long line of Belton Allen Copps, and by the time Bessie and Belton inherited this house, they were a young married couple with 3 children. And this is Bessie and Belton in about 1920, when they were still living in the house, but their children were grown by that time. And here's a picture of Bessie at a younger time in the house, not too long after she first came there with 2 of her children, Emily and Joe. And when Bessie came to this house, she also wanted to make her mark on it. And she set about changing it from the Victorian house of her elderly aunts to her own taste, more along the line of the colonial revival that had come into popularity by that time. She did away with the really fussy wallpaper and the heavy velvet draperies, and the furniture was reupholstered in a simpler way. And part of this was for a new knowledge that people had about germs and cleanliness. They wanted surfaces that could be cleaned and washed, not like like the flocked wallpaper that had been popular, but painted walls that could be kept cleaner. And they wanted light coming in. And so these heavy draperies went. Now, when I say she got rid of things, I don't mean to say she ever threw anything away, because she didn't. She put it away in the attic or in the barn or somewhere in the house, in a closet or somewhere. So all these things are still there. They're just packed away. So we have really a time capsule there of the things that collected in this house over many, many generations. This is how the exterior of the house looked during the time when Bessie and Belton were raising their family there. Another change that Bessie made to the house was to change the exterior color. The house had been a pink color when she inherited it. She changed it to a butterscotch yellow like this, with green shutters and dark brown and maroon trim around the windows and on different decorative woodwork elements. You can see that there's still a horse and buggy on the street there, but there's also a telegraph or telephone pole to the left as well. So this is probably about 1905 to 1910, somewhere around there. Still a lot of trees around the house, but just very different color. Another change that Bessie made, as automobiles came into their own, it changed this street. It became a much busier, dustier, noisier place. So sitting out on a veranda in the front of the house wasn't as desirable as it had been. And Bessie enclosed part of that veranda to make a closed-in entryway. So now you would enter the house into this kind of vestibule type area, and people just weren't sitting out in the front of the house the same way. And in her letter she talks about that, how changed the street had become. This is a view of Thames Street as it was then. It says Picturesque New London at the top, but that's just the book it came from. It's really Thames Street in Groton. And it was a very vital, vibrant, commercial place. There were a lot of stores on this street, grocery stores and clothing stores and a hardware store and coal merchants and feed merchants and a tea room and all the things that people would need living in the neighborhood. They could just walk to all these places and get what they needed. And so that's the way it looked during the time between about 1895 to the 1920s when Bessie and Belton Copp lived there. I want to show you some pictures of the children of Bessie and Belton who grew up there. This is really the last family that was raised in this house. This is Alan Copp, or Belton Alan Copp III, and he was the oldest son of Bessie and Belton. Alan, as he preferred to be called, went to Yale and then became a successful businessman and married and raised a family of his own. And two of his children are sitting in this room tonight. So his children, some have stayed in this area, some have gone off to other areas. They have descendants that have spread around, but people have really maintained an interest in the house over time. The middle child was Emily, and Emily went to Smith College and then came home to Groton and married Warren Burroughs, who was a successful attorney, and they settled in the Pequannock Bridge area of Groton in the old Burroughs house. And one of Emily's sons is living there now, and there are descendants of her living in the area also that have come to visit us and provided us with wonderful little details of information that we'd never get otherwise unless we could talk to people who had known the house and the families who lived there. And this is their third child, their youngest son, Joe. And Joe I'm going to spend a little bit more time on because he's really the one we have to thank for preserving the house the way it is now. This is Joe when he was at college. He went to Yale also, like his older brother had, and he loved rowing, and he was the coxswain on the crew team there. And I think really this was the highlight of his life. He had a lot of good memories of college. He has a lot of pictures of his days there in his bedroom, and he kept up close friendships with some of his friends from that time. Now, Joe also, for a while, left the house and worked in different places, finally going into business with his older brother Alan. But when his parents got older, he came back to the house to live. And when Joe lived there, the Yale-Harvard race was still a big thing, and that was a favorite thing for him. He enjoyed that very much. He lived a long life, and after his parents died in 1930, he stayed on in the house. He himself did not marry, though, until he was in his 70s. So he stayed a bachelor for a long time. He finally married when he was, I believe, 74. He did live to celebrate his 25th wedding anniversary. And he's shown here on his 100th birthday. That's his niece there helping him celebrate. And he lived beyond that. This is Joe at 101, going for his daily walk. Now, when he married, he did not continue to live in the Avery-Copp House full time because he did not want his bride to make any changes to the house. He had gone to great pains to keep this house the way his parents left it. He did bring in the odd piece of furniture that he acquired at an auction or some other, bargain piece that he just couldn't resist. He did, from time to time, have to throw something away, but not much. He kept everything, and I mean everything, rubber bands, paper clips, everything, as well as big things like furniture. He kept books. He kept all the family papers that had built up there over time. If something wore out, for instance, the curtains on the windows, he would have them replicated just as they had been. So he really, through sentiment and frugality, saved this house the way his parents had left it in 1930. And when he passed away in 1991, he left behind him a time capsule. The house and the contents as he had known it as a child and as his parents left it when they died in 1930. So even though he continued to live there for many years up until the 1960s when he married, and then continued to come there on a nearly daily basis for many, many years after that, he didn't change anything. He did maintain a housekeeper there who cared for the house. He had a groundskeeper who took care of all those all that mowing and tree trimming and so on that you can imagine. The same groundskeeper is still there, but he didn't make any changes. So when he passed away, his heirs just recognized the treasure that they had there and have taken steps to preserve what Joe left behind and to make it into a museum so that other people will be able to enjoy it and learn from it. So that is the first part of my program, just talking about how the house got to be a museum, how it got on the road to where it is now. And so what I'd like to do now is just have you pretend you are coming there for a visit, and we'll just walk through the rooms and you can see what they look like. I'm going to begin, though, by going back in time to Mary Jane Ramsdell. If you could be visiting her, this is what you would see. This is the parlor, and this is the fanciest room in the house. It's a room where visitors would have been invited when they first came, and it was designed to be a place to show off, really. It's a place where you'd have your most valuable possessions, a place where Victorian people would have liked to display things from other countries to show that they had either traveled or had knowledge of other parts of the world, things relating to history, both, it might be classical history, ancient Greece or Rome, or it might be family history, like a needlepoint made by an ancestor because they valued their early colonial ancestors and wanted to show that they were not newcomers. They were from well-established families. So this was Mary Jane Ramsdell's parlor. And the next slide I'm going to show you is the parlor as it looks today. I'd like you to just look at that mirror, though, because you'll notice it in the next slide. Also, many of these other items, the table and furniture and decorative objects are still in the house. They might be in other rooms, but they're still there. That's dark. It's hard in this light to see it, but at least we can see the mirror. The mirror's still there, and as are all the other decorative objects. Let's go to the next slide where it might be a little better light. Well, you can see the river. There we look out onto the, and you can see the shadows anyway of some of these exotic pieces of oriental porcelain and things like that that people would either bring back in their travels or actually purchase just to show that they had knowledge of these things. Well, I think the lights are pretty bright to be able to see some of these pictures. I'm just going to skip over that one. Well, here's one that'll show up. This shows up in person too. This is in the library, and this is a vase that's a very exotic and unusual and attention-grabbing piece, and that's just what it would have been meant to do at the time when Mary Jane Ramsdell would have acquired it. The handles look like snakes at the top, and there are all kinds of depictions from mythology on it, and it's big. It's probably 2.5 to 3 feet tall. In this library, there are also classical things. If we could see this better, it's a pediment with a statue on top of it. Behind that is a bookcase, and I just want you to keep that bookcase in your mind because later on when we talk about wallpaper, I'll mention it again. We removed this bookcase at one time and found a lot of old wallpaper behind that. This is another of Mary Jane Ramsdell's era, the dining room. And we have in the dining room today just everything that's in that picture, just not the wallpaper. The walls and the ceiling were decorated completely. And a heavy cloth on the table and also on top of the mantel. Those things are gone, but all the furniture is still there. And, well, you can sort of see it in this picture, but you'll have to take my word since it's so dark. This corner china cabinet that was in the previous picture is filled with Chinese export porcelain that was brought back by Latham Avery, one of the men who had been born in this house, or at least grew up in it. He was a brother of Mary Jane Ramsdell, and traveled to Hong Kong and brought back beautiful things like this porcelain. This is a close-up of it, and it's porcelain that was made for the export trade and specifically to be sold to Westerners. And it is just beautiful, and we have over 100 pieces of that there. This is the sitting room, or what would have been, as we call a family room today. This is the room that the family used on a regular basis. The parlor was kept for special events, special visitors, and just not a place where you'd be going every day. The sitting room was where you would be in the evening, either playing cards or talking, or you'll notice a piano in that alcove back there. And I want just to be thinking about that piano because that's one piece we don't have anymore at the house. It was gotten rid of, and I'll show you what replaced it in some of the later slides. In that alcove right now, you would see a sofa, if we could see that a little bit better. There's a sofa there, but the pictures above it are the very same. There are bookshelves in there that still have the same books in them. This is the mirror above the fireplace there. That's Napoleon standing there. So even in the sitting room, in a place where people would have been relaxing in the evening, they still had these decorative objects that were meant to evoke thoughts of another country or knowledge of history. We have Victorian things like this shelf. It wasn't enough for Victorian people just to have a shelf. It had to be embellished and be decorative. And there's an angel on the top of that one. In the same room, there is another one with a dog, and another one with a deer head, and another one with a beautiful maiden. So they would, and then all these leaves going around it. So that's a remnant from a time when every surface was meant to have some decorative object on it. Here is the phonograph, and that's what replaced that piano. Before the phonograph, people would only have music if somebody knew how to make music, if someone could play the piano or the violin or the guitar. Once the phonograph came, you could buy any kind of music that you might like to listen to and play it whenever you wanted. So this was a big innovation. This is an Edison phonograph, and one of the things that's really special about it is that one of the family members wrote a letter to Thomas Edison telling him how satisfied they were with the quality of this phonograph and just how wonderful it was. And he wrote back saying he was really pleased that they liked it so much. And of course, because everything was saved, we still have that letter. So we have the phonograph and we have the letter and we have about 100 phonograph records that go with it. But the phonograph also, as wonderful as it was eventually replaced by this radio. And I opened the top to show these glass tubes that are inside it that are about the size of light bulbs. And this was something much favored by Bessie Copp. She remarked in one of her letters she didn't know why anybody would want a piano when they could have the radio, because this was even better than the phonograph. You could have live music on there, or you could listen to soap operas on there. And so it opened up a whole new realm. Long after this radio became obsolete, Joe Copp refused to part with it. He kept it right where it had always been, and just because that's where it always was. And so there it still is, and it's wonderful for us to have it today. Well, you'll have to pretend this is a night visit with a flashlight. So here we are going up the stairs to the second floor landing. And in this landing on the left, there is a chaise lounge where you could relax there and read in the afternoon. It's a lovely sunny spot in the afternoon. There's also a desk there, and that was Bessie's desk. And it provided a wonderful vantage point of everything going on the street. She could sit there and do her work and watch what happened there. I'll go through the bedrooms up here. There are 3 large-sized bedrooms on this floor and 1 small one. The small one was Joe's room when he was a boy, and he continued to keep that room throughout his life. He did eventually sleep in one of the bigger rooms, but he always kept his possessions in the little room. The other rooms are quite large and full of light and have just beautiful furniture, some of them much more furniture than you would ever need, because they started out full, and then as family members passed away, they would leave their possessions to different nieces and nephews, and more furniture kept coming. So not only are the rooms full, but so is the attic and the carriage house. So this is another one of the bedrooms, and you'll see things from many eras. There's a washstand with a pitcher and a bowl there long after they had indoor plumbing. There are also chamber pots in these rooms. You'll see lots of candles, even though electricity was there. So they just kept things. This bedroom, the furniture really is black. It was a style called ebonizing, where people would paint the furniture black to emulate ebony wood. And at one time, the walls in this room were gold. And so I think how dramatic that was with this black furniture and gold walls. That was the bedroom of the daughter, Emily. And this is part of Joe's little room, and a lot of his keepsakes that are on that dresser there. College pictures of himself and his friends, and things from trips he went on. And that there's a package there tied up with string that still has fabric in it that he might need. He never threw anything away. If he bought pants that he was short, so they'd have to cut off the bottom and hem them, he would save that fabric in case he ever wore a hole in those pants. He'd have something to patch it with. The drawers of that dresser are full of Christmas presents that people gave him that he was reserving, until his other socks wore out. So there are about a dozen pairs of brand new socks there still. This is in the bathroom. This is the medicine cabinet. And this is just a fascinating thing. This is a great example of what the house is like. This medicine cabinet has in it medicine from the 1890s up through the 1960s. If there was one pill left or a few drops of something, it would not be thrown away. And that preserved for us all this, just a wonderful capsule of family medicine over those years. We have an intern who did an inventory last year and then researched each object to see when it came on the market and what it was used for. And it's just a fascinating collection that you just couldn't replicate. In most museums, you'll have a house and have to set about furnishing it with appropriate items. But here we have it. We have more than that we could furnish 3 houses. But we have all this medicine in here, so that's really a neat thing to look at. This is the kitchen. We have the old wood-burning stove there, or it can burn coal as well. Next to it, to the left, if you could see that, there's another stove that once this one became obsolete, they didn't get rid of it, they just put another one next to it. So we have a 1930s one. There was also a 1950s one, which we had to move to make a little bit more room in there. But I'd like to originally see this room restored to the kitchen that it was. Right now it's serving a dual purpose as a kitchen and an office. But eventually I hope to see it back to its kitchen. We have all the appliances, the old washing machines and all those kind of things can be brought back into it. This is the pantry, which still has everything. It has all kinds of jars and bottles and bowls and old irons that had to be heated on the stove. It has a 1927 refrigerator. It has containers that still have food in them, like cocoa and tea and things like that. So it's also a time capsule. So that kind of completes the walkthrough of the house as you might see it if you visited there. And this is what we found when we came there and started trying to prepare it to make the transition from a family home to a museum. And when I say we, I'm often talking about Mary Beth, who is here, who works now at the Stonington Historical Society, but worked with me there for years. We came in and we found a house really that had been mothballed, but not with any mothballs. So we had a lot of moths. We had all kind of issues like that to contend with. We addressed cleaning and maintenance issues first, and this is an example of one of those. This is a dresser drawer that had been closed up after the person stopped using it, but with all the stuff there, just like if you walked away from your house today and someone came along in 50 years and opened one of your drawers. It's just a jumble of stuff in there. There's clothing in there. There's a photograph of somebody there. There might be a bar of soap in there. There might be letters. So we had to empty that out, catalog it, clean it, and then store it back so that people who might be interested in it someday could see it. We might find things in there that were really important, like an account book of the expenses from 1914, say. Or we might find really trivial things that you can't imagine why anybody saved, but all that had to be gone through. We have an attic. There's an antelope head up there. There are trunks full of all kinds of things like clothing and household things that were stored up there. There are several attic spaces just packed with things that we had to, has still not been gone through. And that's something that will be addressed over time because we've had to prioritize. There would be some maintenance issues that we really had to attend to at the time. Some things will be waiting for interested volunteers or interns who might want to take on those jobs, or as we go along over the years, we'll address them. So that attic is still pretty full of stuff. This is an example of what a desk would look like. This was Bessie's desk, and it has everything in it just as if when she died, her desk was closed and left just as it was. And there are letters in there. There are recipes, there are grocery lists, there are bottles of glue that have hardened and things like that. But it makes a wonderful way to be able to find out what she was doing and thinking and who was writing to her and what was life like at the time that she lived there. So one of the challenges we've had in the house is sorting out archival material between all these generations of family documents, not just Bessie and Belton's generation, but before them as well. The family was in the habit of recording every penny spent, and I do mean every penny. So we can know when they had painting done, or when they bought wallpaper, or when they put up a fence, and how much it cost, what plants they bought that spring for the garden, so that hopefully someday when we can restore those gardens, we know what was growing there. In some ways, it's like going back and having a conversation with them. We had to address the maintenance or the care of some of the artwork in the house. There are a lot of prints and paintings in the house. This is a watercolor painting that had to be taken out of its frame and rematted and reframed using acid-free material, because it had been the habit in the 19th century to back pieces of art with cedar shingles, which are very acidic, and as the wood deteriorates over time, that acid migrates into the artwork and starts to destroy it as well. So dozens of these things had to be taken apart and preserved in an acid-free environment. This is a picture frame. The oil painting from there had been sent away for conservation, and while it was gone, this frame was being cleaned. And the little rosette things down in the bottom left-hand side have not been cleaned yet, and they're just embedded with all kinds of grime, especially from when coal was used as a heat source. A lot of oily debris would settle on things in the house, and so all those little things on the right are about 100 Q-tips that would be used to clean away those things. And they do look beautiful when they're done, and it was time-consuming but well worth doing. This is a chair that had been used as a scratching post by cats. The housekeeper that lived there for a while had some cats, and they became frustrated when they could no longer go outdoors, and they used the furniture for scratching. And so we had to address that. Luckily, we were able to find reproduction fabric that matched what we needed. And so all this furniture now has been reupholstered the way it would have looked when Bessie Copp had it done. Bessie also saved all the fabric samples when she was trying to decide how to do her dining room chairs. We have all the ones she debated between before she chose this one. So that's now been done. But these were all things we had to prioritize. This is another chair. I put this in here just to show the effect of light on fabric. The cats did have a go at the back of this chair too, you can see that, but you can also see how the arm to the left is still a very dark blue, and that was not in the sun. The back faced the window and it has been bleached out. So we had to address light damage and get light blocking window shades for all these windows so that we could prevent that from happening in the future. The carpets, almost all the rooms have beautiful oriental carpets. We found out when we addressed the cleaning of those that moths strongly prefer certain colors. They love green and brown, and they don't like red and blue. So the carpets that have red and blue are in beautiful condition, but some of the green and brown ones really needed some serious care. So that was another thing we dealt with early on. Refinishing the floors was something we did about a year and a half ago. The part of the floor on the right was before refinishing, and you can see how years and years of just use, foot traffic and grime that had built up on there had really darkened it. On the left is what the floors looked like when Mary Jane Ramsdell had them put in. And now they look that way again because they've been refinished. This is another view of that. It's a maple and cherry, and just really glows in the sunlight, or at night. It's really pretty in there. It was really made you feel like you didn't want to put the carpets back after you had that done. So that was an important thing we did last year. Sometimes it's unexpected maintenance. Like last winter, our boiler failed, and what happened is that water stopped going into it, and it cracked, and it became hot, that chimney, just to a very high level. And this is the Groton City Fire Department who came to make sure that we didn't have a fire in there, in the wall. And we were very worried about that, but it turned out to be okay. But it's an unexpected maintenance that you get with an old house, and So we had to get a new boiler, but before we could have that, we had to have the chimney lined because it was out of, modern codes. And before we could have that, we had to have asbestos removed from the cellar. So all those things were major expenses that we hadn't planned on, and that's something that a museum often has to cope with an old house. Here are our painters. This was a big project that we started about 2 years ago. We decided, because the era that we're interpreting in this museum is the time when Bessie and Belton Copp lived there, from 1895 to 1930, we had wanted to restore the paint to the colors that Bessie had when she was there. The paint had been kept those colors for many, many years until Joe Copp was in his late 90s. And the last time the house was painted, the housekeeper that was living there was able to choose the colors. And so she chose some colors that were pleasing to her, but were not the same as Bessie's, because of course those had gone out of style by then. So we had what's called a paint analysis done, where we had someone come who would analyze the paint and tell us what color it really was in her time period. So before we could progress to the stage you're seeing here, we underwent this paint analysis, and we made a lot of discoveries at that time about the history of the house. One of them being this wallpaper. This is that bookcase that I was telling you about in the library. When we removed that to see if there was wallpaper behind it, because we knew the house had been papered, but there were no traces of it anywhere anymore. So we took that out and found that indeed there was old wallpaper behind there, not just one layer, but 7 layers. So we could see the history of paper in this house before 1868. And we knew it was before 1868 because the workman who built the bookcase did some graffiti on the wall behind it. He knew he was covering up this wallpaper, so he drew on it and wrote on it. And so we knew when he did it. And so we saved some samples of all these papers, and I have them in a book at the back if anyone's interested in looking at that. We weren't planning to replicate the wallpaper at all, but we just wanted to know about it, to know the history of the house. There was other paper on the walls after this because we know it from those old photographs, but we don't have samples of that. We do have the first 7 though. This is a slide that's a microscopic, a photograph taken with a microscope of a paint sample. And this is what the paint analysis people do. They look at it, and there are many layers, about 8 layers there of paint that a certain room was over time. And many of them were white, so it's kind of hard to tell that, the differences in shade. But some were other colors like pink and yellow. And then they stain it and look at it under ultraviolet light, and this is how it looks that way. And through doing this, they can determine not just that a room was pink, but what shade of pink it was. Because these paints that are made with linseed oil will darken or fade over time depending on whether they're exposed to light or not, and how long they're covered up. So in the end, we were able to determine the colors of all the downstairs rooms in the house and have them repainted to the colors that Bessie Copp had when she lived there. In the process, we found some surprises. We found that some of the rooms had been stenciled. They had stenciled borders. And this is one of them. This is in the parlor, which before the painting was done had several layers of yellow paint on top of Bessie's pink. And when the walls were pink, they had this beautiful stencil on it, all around the border at the top of the room. And so we've uncovered a section of that we'll just keep to have the original there for people to look at. But one of the projects that we plan on doing in the winter is replicating it around the rest of the room. And in the back, I have a sample made up of that as well. Upstairs, we also found some stenciling. This is an even more elaborate one. And this was in the entry hall, both downstairs and upstairs. And it also shows the ceiling. This is the ceiling up here. The whole ceiling was stenciled as well. Now, I don't plan to try and redo the ceiling, but I would like to someday do that stencil that's on the border there. It's really pretty if you can see it in real life, and it's big. That's about half life size in that slide right there. Then comes the outside maintenance. This is what we've been working on this year. As with any old house, the ravages of time really take a toll on this woodwork. And this house is right on the river. It gets a lot of abuse from the weather, a lot of salt, a lot of wind, a lot of rain. And a lot of the decorative features on the outside of the house had started to decay from that. And this is an example of that. These are some decorative pieces of woodwork that had fallen off the house and were gathered up over the years and had to be replicated and then put back on. This is a decorative balustrade in the back of the house. This summer, this was all taken apart, and any pieces that could be saved were saved, and the ones that couldn't be had to be remade, and then it was all put back together, and now it'll last maybe another 50 or even 100 years. But it looks really good now. This is the workman who was doing that. And it's time-consuming work. It takes a lot of skill to be able to replicate the old decorative pieces, and it really gives me a lot of respect for the craftsmen who did that without the modern tools that we have now. Their workmanship is just incredible. This is our front porch, and that was really in dire need of some work. It faces straight onto the river, and it had deteriorated considerably over the years. This shows the decking, that when the carpenters started to work on this, they found that the nails had just rusted away. They could just lift these boards right up. They didn't even need tools to remove them. These are the stairs on the side of it, and in some places, the only thing holding them together was really thick accretions of paint, and the wood underneath the paint was just gone. So they weren't really safe to walk on at all. We also have a lot of makeshift repairs around the house that happened over time. This is the base of a post on that same porch, where you can see somebody, instead of really replacing it, just put in another chunk of wood there, and then another one under that, and then there were a lot of wires holding it together. And so then the wires would rust away. And so they were innovative and frugal ways of dealing with a problem that was probably meant to be temporary, but it became a permanent fix, and then a big problem in the end. So this summer we addressed that, and these are the workmen fixing the porch. The light color wood is wood that could be saved, and all the unpainted is wood that they had to replicate, the trim and the balusters and things, and try and make it like new. Another challenge they faced, that it's not like building a new porch, because you have to account for the settling of the building and all the old features that you have to fit the new stuff into. So you have to build things crooked, and that's not how they're used to doing it. So that was a challenge for them. This is a curved stairway that goes from the kitchen porch up onto one of the terraces of the grounds, and that posed some particular challenges. On the outside, it's built like a big barrel, and then these curved stairs that go up there. But that came out really well, and it just gives you access to the grounds that you just don't have otherwise. This is the front porch all done, looking like new and feeling really sturdy. It's so nice to be able to walk on it and not have to pick where you step. And we can now use the front door for visitors, and we couldn't do that before. These are the gazebos who are now undergoing the same treatment. They had suffered over the years, not only from the weather, but from trees that had fallen on them. And sometimes the repairs were done, on this one particularly, it was glued back together rather than having carpentry, really fix it. So they had to take it apart and fix it. A lot of it could be saved, though. The parts that were protected from the weather underneath, all that decorative woodwork was still in pretty good shape, but the part down at the bottom they had to copy that and put that in. And it's now getting new shingles and will last a long time, I think, after this. It's nice to see it getting a new lease on life, because those are really integral parts of our landscape. That's another view of that stencil. These are coming projects. These are my hopes for next year, to replicate the stencil in the parlor and in the library. This is one of the gardens at the house. Behind the dining room, there's a rock garden where the house really is built right into a rocky ledge, and it allows a really nice place to grow shade plants. It's very moist back there. And so we've restored that garden using plants that would have been popular 100 years ago. And it's a beautiful garden, but there were many other gardens on the property as well. So I'd like over time to bring those back. This is a view from the house down to the Carriage House. And that is our big project that's going to be coming along in the spring. That Carriage House is going to be turned into an office and a meeting room similar to this, and an archive storage facility. So we'll be able to move all of our archives out of the attic where they're now stored, and the old servants' quarters, and take them down there, and then make the servants' quarters back into the rooms that they were, and tell the story of the servants that lived there. There were, over the years, different Irish immigrants who lived there and worked as servants. The kitchen, which is now a makeshift office, will be able to be a kitchen again. And we'll be able to give talks down there and offer the space to groups for meetings, and rent out the property, hopefully for people who might like to have weddings there or other events. So that'll open up a whole new dimension for us when that's done. And then we're back to the front. And another big project next year involves the paint. As we look at the house right now, these colors are kind of a modification on what was left by Joe Kopp. It's a little bit updated from what he had, but not any historically accurate color that the house ever was. So what we would like to do in the spring, when the house gets repainted, is to bring the colors back to Bessie Avery-Copp's color scheme, because that's what we have inside, and we want the outside to match that time period. So the house is going to change drastically. It will again be butterscotch yellow, and with green and brown and maroon. So it's going to be a big change. I think it'll be beautiful. When we did that inside, at first, when I saw the little color swatches, I thought, oh my gosh, I just can't adapt to this. It was just too different than what we were used to. But once those colors went on the walls, it really works with the house, and as you walk from room to room, you can see it's just the right thing. And I hope the outside will have the same feeling. The house really needs paint, and so this is the time to do that. And we're really excited to be able to have that done. So I hope you'll come and visit us and see these changes as they go on. Again, we'll have our holiday open house later this month if you'd like to see the house as it is now and see it at night, which is a kind of fun time to be able to walk through a museum. And then come in the spring and see the house being painted, and visit our new Carriage House office, and just come visit us. So thanks so much.